Hey everyone, this is Kyle from Notional Finance, and you're listening to the Notable Builders podcast. There are more DeFi projects than ever to keep up with, so we're going behind the scenes to chat with the real builders, the people driving innovation, bringing in new users, and creating real value for the entire ecosystem. Today, Teddy talks with Jack Sanford from Sherlock. The Sherlock team is focused on reinventing and scaling smart contract insurance, something he says hasn't changed much since the ICO days of 2017. Instead of selling coverage directly to end users, Sherlock goes after the protocol directly, with their own team of security researchers doing the due diligence. Will it scale? Time will tell. Enjoy.
All right, well, today we have Jack Sanford from Sherlock on the Notable Builders podcast from Notional Finance. So to start things off, Jack, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and then maybe say a couple words on what Sherlock is, what it does, and what makes you guys different?
Sure, be happy to. Thanks for having me on the podcast, by the way. Appreciate it. And hopefully we'll have a fun session today. Yeah, so I guess to give a little personal background, from LA, went to Berkeley, spent the first 20 years of my life playing really competitive tennis, had some injuries, and decided to be a hedge fund manager. So did the classic finance track that a lot of us in DeFi have been through. I know some of the notional guys have as well. Basically went to Berkeley, did the business school there, worked at Morgan Stanley for 2 years in investment banking, then worked at Citadel for 2 years on the long short equity side, basically trading bank stocks, financial companies. And then decided getting up at 2 a.m. on the West Coast wasn't for me. So actually left and got into programming, building all kinds of different iPhone apps, a bunch of random stuff, machine learning projects, and then got into DeFi in 2020. Sort of the impetus was the CARES Act, and I had always had some very strong opinions about the financial crisis and that we bailed out the banks in 2008. Never liked it. Finally, got over it and wrote it off as like a once in 100-year black swan event. And then, of course, with the CARES Act and coronavirus and quarantine, we bailed out a bunch of airline companies that hadn't managed their balance sheets well and stuff like that. So I finally said, you know what, I'm gonna YOLO into crypto and figure out what's going on there. Found DeFi, and the rest is history in terms of my career. Never been so excited to be building in a space, or never been so excited to wake up in the morning. So really glad DeFi is a thing.
Even more exciting than being a tennis pro. And by the way, I didn't know that. I didn't realize that was the standard financial progression there, tennis pro to hedge fund manager.
Yeah, it's I wouldn't recommend it. It's a lot easier to not spend 5 hours a day in college playing tennis. But yeah, maybe there was some good that came out of it. I don't really know. But I'm way too competitive still, so I'm trying to unlearn from those days. And then I guess to go quickly into Sherlock, we're really focused on smart contract insurance. So again, back to the story of early 2020, CARES Act, DeFi, got obsessed with it and basically just said, how do we make DeFi successful? How do we get DeFi to the masses? What's going to hold DeFi back? And one of the biggest things, I mean, there's a bunch of things back then. Scaling was a huge one, but there was a bunch of people taking on scaling and trying to, create other L1s or, use optimistic rollups. And Vitalik had laid out some good roadmaps there. So, there were a lot of problems, but the problem that we kind of saw that no one was working on was really the security side of things. And if you look at the security landscape, there hasn't been a lot of innovation. Basically 2017, the ICO boom, the auditors kind of came onto the scene and became a fixture in crypto. And the state of the art became, all right, get an audit or two on your code and then deploy it to mainnet and kind of cross your fingers and hope for the best. I mean, that's 2017. We're basically still doing the same thing in 2022. So there's definitely a lot of room for improvement there. And we see these massive hacks that are still happening. They've been happening for years now. And so that's kind of why Sherlock was started, because we saw auditors are super smart. I almost became a smart contract auditor at one point. And then we realized, okay, auditors are great. They've got the entire space on their back. They're doing a bunch of difficult things, but there's still that 1% of hacks that are getting through the audit filter and causing all the damage, wreaking havoc, all of that. And so we decided, like, okay, how can we stop that 1%? And we can't do it by being really smart, because there's already a lot of really smart auditors doing that. And so we kind of looked at it and said, well, it looks like a really interesting model for insurance, or kind of setup for insurance, because you've got all these protocols that are still worried about being hacked, and maybe they're using good security practices and doing all the right things, but they can never prove that they can't be hacked. So you really need some kind of recourse, some kind of guarantee there, and insurance fits really well into that. And also, these hacks, when they happen, they can drain an entire protocol's entire TVL. So I think insurance is also pretty useful for the protocol itself to know, like, hey, we're going to be able to survive even if we have one of these one-off kind of exploits. So that's why Sherlock is working on smart contract insurance. We think it's going to be one of the most important pieces of getting DeFi to the masses, and having end users from different countries all over the place who maybe aren't as financially savvy. They can just stroll up into DeFi and start using it, and not have to worry so much about buying and managing their own insurance and those kind of things.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we definitely agree. Smart contract risk is, I still think it's kind of the biggest impediment to people using DeFi, just because it's potentially catastrophic, right? And it's so hard to sort of quantify, and it's such an unknown, and it's so new. I think that it's a real problem. So we definitely agree on that. And I think that there are other sort of insurance options out there. I think some of the people listening might be familiar with. So maybe could you tell a little bit about, what makes Sherlock different, and how you guys are trying to solve this problem in kind of a different way?
Yeah, definitely. So, like you said, there's probably, if you look on DeFi Llama or something, there's probably like 20 other insurance type of plays out there that are trying to solve this problem in one way or another. Even with all those other insurance players, we kind of see ourselves as like being, if they're all sitting together in a house, we're like out in the woods by ourselves, and just taking a totally different approach. And maybe we're going to freeze to death out there, or maybe we're going to find some buried treasure, but we're kind of by ourselves. And so, in terms of the approach and why that is, we're really focused on selling protocol to protocol. And, that's a huge part of scaling DeFi to the masses, making sure that end users don't have to manage insurance positions, is being able to bake that insurance into the protocol itself. So, like, if you go to a Chase Bank and open up a checking account, FDIC insurance is already baked in. If you go to Coinbase and open a new account, you've already got insurance that they've done through Lloyd's of London on their hot money funds. So we think that is the scalable approach to insuring financial products. And so we've very much focused only on selling to protocols, whereas all the other insurance providers out there that you've probably heard of, like Nexus and others, they're really focused on selling it to end users. So a big difference there. And then another one is just the way that we approach pricing and kind of filtering protocols. The other approaches, or I guess even the traditional approach, is really focused on looking at past data and understanding, okay, what is the future, extrapolating that to what the future might look like in terms of losses. We don't think that's a great approach in DeFi, because it's so new, because there's only, maybe 100 hacks maximum that you could learn from. And there's probably like 50 features at least that you'd want to put into that machine learning model to help you learn more about the characteristics of those exploits and why they happen. So we don't think that's a great approach. There's other approaches out there, like using sort of bonding curves to decide based on demand what the price of coverage should be. And we've really taken this approach of, let's go deep on every protocol. Let's have security experts look into it, and let's try to figure out the pricing based on that. And I think that's helped us a lot on the LP side, because people have to trust, if they're putting their funds into an insurance protocol and providing coverage that way, they have to trust that they're not going to lose all their money. And so I think we have an advantage there in being able to say, like, yes, we've looked into these protocols, like we've done fundamental analysis on them to understand what the risks are. So that's another big one. And then there's a whole claims process thing we can talk about. There's like 3 different camps on the claims side, and we can get into that too. But I think Sherlock's got a pretty different approach there than the way most others are going about it.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So basically, if I'm understanding you correctly, what you're saying is you kind of, as opposed to having the LPs try to judge the risk and price the risk of a smart contract hack themselves. You're sort of like, I guess, I don't know, like outsourcing that process to a team of, an in-house team of experts. And then the LPs write the insurance at the sort of price you recommend, right? So basically, like, the idea being that, like, you have your guys who know what the price should be and are in a better position to know what the price should be than just, guys that just have money and want to earn some returns. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, that's exactly how we think about it. And there's a bunch of parallels to that approach in, traditional finance, whether it's, I guess, one that we always look at is sort of pension funds. It would be like having LPs decide on smart contract risk themselves is kind of like having pension funds pick their own stocks. And yes, they could do it, but they probably can't do it as well as a hedge fund that's focused just on one specific area, like merger arb or whatever it is, long short. And so we think that like a pension fund delegates capital to a hedge fund because the hedge fund has the expertise, we think it makes a lot of sense for LPs to kind of delegate their capital to these security experts. And you have to get the incentives aligned. So that's an important piece of it. It doesn't work if the hedge fund's incentives aren't aligned with the pension fund. But if you can get the incentives aligned, then I think it's a much more efficient way to allocate the capital by having, the experts who know deeply, having them allocated instead of LPs who probably don't, can't read Solidity or haven't looked into every single protocol and compared their risks against each other.
I get it. I think that makes a lot of sense. The two questions that arise for me, like off the top of my head, though, is, one about the alignment of incentives. So it's the LPs that are taking the risk, but it's somebody else that's coming up with the price for it. So how do you handle the problem of basically the guy who's going to take the hit isn't the guy who came up with the price? And that can be kind of like a conflict, right? Because maybe depending on the incentive model, maybe the guy that's coming up with the price just wants more insurance to be written because he gets paid every time, somebody takes out a policy. And so maybe he's incentivized to say it's not risky when it is more risky. So I just would see that as like a natural place where, problems might arise. And I'm curious how you handle that.
I think that's a great question, and a super important part of our model is aligning the incentives between security experts who are choosing protocols, filtering protocols, and the sort of LPs who are providing the capital. And so one way we approached it was, okay, well, we can have security experts stake some sort of capital, and then they have some skin in the game in terms of they'll lose capital if they're wrong, but that's a really difficult thing because some security experts, they've done really well. They've worked at some top audit firms, or they've made some really, $1 million bug bounties, and maybe staking 10K or 50K isn't that big of a deal to them. Whereas other security experts, they're just starting out, they're fresh out of college or maybe high school, and they don't have a ton of capital. So they can't even participate if there's a, $50,000 stake you have to do. So the way we really decided to approach it was, okay, well, all these security experts care really deeply about their time. So if we have them look into this protocol for 2 weeks, write up the report, talk to the team, make sure that they're going fairly deep and spending a lot of time on this, then they're effectively staking 2 weeks worth of their time, and their compensation then gets vested over 6 months and beyond, from the time the protocol goes live on mainnet that they covered. And so if there is a hack that happens in that 6 months or in that beyond time, then they get some or all of their compensation clawed back. And so they've effectively worked for free for 2 weeks, which is something that as a security expert, you would never, ever want to do. And so that's the way that we've found the most success in incentivizing security experts to really dig deep on saying, okay, do I feel like I can take on a certain protocol on chain for 6 months or whatever it is, and not have it experience any exploits, because if it does, I'm not going to get paid for all this work that I'm doing. So that's sort of the approach that we've taken and found to be somewhat successful.
Yeah, that's an interesting approach, because I think you're right. When you think about, like, okay, what could, like, one of these guys care about as much as the LP losing his money because he insured a bad protocol? what could somebody care about that much? And I think you're right. If the thing gets hacked and they just wasted 6 months, I mean, I think we both know how kind of in demand these guys are. So I get it. I think that's an interesting way to do it. And I think it makes sense. And so kind of going off that, another question is like, who are these guys, these security experts? And then how do you get them to like work for you? Because I mean, the big part of this is that these guys are in super high demand, right? Like, I mean, auditors make tons of money. Bug bounties, they're like $1 million bug bounties flying around. How do you get these guys to work for you?
That's a question we get a lot. And I think, when we started Sherlock, we thought it was going to be a lot of blocking and tackling, sort of having to find security experts, hire them full time, maybe take them away from whatever their current job was in order to do that and, pay up in order to have them sort of take a chance on us in that way. But as we were building this, we kind of saw a new channel of security experts emerging where the way to think about it is most security experts, they work at an audit firm. It's kind of a 9 to 5 job. You get assigned different audits. The audit firm takes a really big cut of your pay. And then we started seeing sort of like the gig economy in security work spring up, where a lot of these really successful security experts who had spent 2 years at consensus diligence or had done really well for themselves just decided like, actually, I don't want to work 9 to 5 anymore. I don't want to have this audit firm take, whatever percent of my earnings. I'm going to work 2 weeks out of the month instead of 4 weeks out of the month. And I'm going to do it on my terms and take on protocols I want to take on. And so, we kind of saw that channel early and got a little bit lucky because we've basically had unfiltered access to that channel because we do some work to understand like, okay, is this security expert talented? A lot of them take part in code arena, so you can kind of see the critical bugs that they find that others are missing, or you can stack them against other security experts who are looking at the same protocol over the same time. And you can also, we have a lot of friends at this point in the security space, so we can understand like, hey, this person worked at consensus diligence, they led these audits, like they're very talented. And so that's another way to kind of understand individuals in the security space. And so for us, we've kind of been like a little bit of the Uber of security work instead of the traditional taxi company, I guess, traditional audit firm, where we've been able to really take advantage of that gig work. And it works way better for us because we don't utilize a lot of these guys all the time. We don't always have protocols every single week that we want them to look at. And so it works better for them to take time off and work when they want to work. And it works better for us to pay them only when they're actually doing gigs for us. So we've been pretty lucky in that sense. And we know that's not going to last forever. I think there's already some audit firms that are kind of changing things a little bit to be able to take advantage of this talent pool. But, we're doing things as well. Rajiv Gopalakrishna is one of our advisors. He started the Securian Boot Camp. It's basically the best and only security expert boot camp that's going on right now in Web3. And, we've been very active with that. We sponsored a CTF for the top 32 students last month there. So I think we've figured out how to find really good talent and curate it and kind of get them activated in a way that they want to participate.
That's really interesting. I think we can keep talking about that, but just to move kind of to the other side of this, well, one other side anyway. I've always been curious about, the kind of people that provide insurance capital, because I think that the flip side of smart contract risk being such a deterrent and insurance being so needed is that who wants to take that risk? And it's always been something I've wondered about is who wants to put up their capital and take the risk that it goes to zero basically for only a couple percentage points of return. Perhaps I'm not characterizing that risk reward proposition accurately. So maybe if you do want to clarify that and just talk a little bit about who these people are and why they do this. Yeah.
I think by and large that trend that you're identifying is pretty accurate, and I think that's been one of the biggest sort of things holding back the insurance space. Like if you look at insurance and DeFi and you compare it to other sectors, like it's not really grown much at all, and any growth is just people's ETH that's locked in one of these protocols just going up. There's been very little new funds coming into the insurance space in the last 6 months or year probably. And it really is because of this issue that you are highlighting, which is hey, this is a scary bet. I'm making a few percentage points and I might lose a lot of money if one of these hacks occur. Maybe there's better places I can be making bets. And so, I think there's a few ways that we approach that. One is, like I said earlier, the only way you're going to really get the trust of LPs is by doing the fundamental analysis on protocols and really sort of handpicking, going in, looking at the code of every single protocol, understanding it, and figuring out what you think the likelihood of exploit is and all of that. And so I think that's a big advantage for us is these LPs, they're like, so how do you guys know that this is all safe? And most insurance protocols, the answer is, well, we don't, but here's like 6 months worth of data that seems to indicate this could be, a profitable trade for you by a few percentage points. And they're like, okay, no thanks. That doesn't sound good at all. So I think one advantage we have is actually doing that deep fundamental analysis to figure out where we think these bets are good bets in the space. And another is just like everybody, it's like a question of who would ever take this risk. Well, we're all taking this risk. If you participate in DeFi, you're taking this risk every day, probably across a few different protocols, because if you're using any DeFi protocol, you're taking smart contract risk. So I think there's sort of a messaging problem that needs to be fixed there, which is everyone is okay taking single protocol risk when they're kind of putting their money into a protocol and not thinking about the smart contract risk so much. But as soon as you start aggregating 5 or 10 protocols and that smart contract risk, all of a sudden people say, oh no, that's way too crazy for me, I'd never do it. So I think there just needs to be some history, some trust, and I think it's a difficult thing to do, and that's why Sherlock has been so sort of slow to grow in a way. We've been in a guarded launch for the last 6 months. Really, we've been trying to prove out that hey, we can actually underwrite in a way that limits losses significantly. And another thing is, if you're an LP, you don't lose all of your money. If one of these bets goes bad, if there is an exploit, you lose about a third of it. So it's a little bit better. It's still not great, still not something you want to happen. But and I think that a third will go down to a quarter at some point. Will go down to a fifth. So it'll start becoming something that is a more reasonable risk to take. But that's a really great point. That's a really great, sort of identification of a problem in insurance. And I don't think anyone's figured it out yet. And what it looks like, what solving that problem looks like, is history of performing well over time. And that just takes time and building trust. And so it's not a problem that you can solve in a day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that it's kind of the story of DeFi in aggregate, right? Is that it takes a lot of time for people to feel comfortable and safe and develop the trust that you need. Yeah, and I think there's kind of no substitute for time, realistically. Yeah. Okay, so would you say that maybe that's been kind of your biggest challenge in sort of growing Sherlock and getting it off the ground, or what would you say has been your biggest challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Sherlock is a marketplace and Notional is also a marketplace. Like a lot of DeFi protocols are marketplaces, and that means you're always going to have multiple like problem vectors. Sherlock, I almost think of as like a three-sided marketplace with the security experts. And so you're not always going to have one big problem. It's more like whack-a-mole of running around to these three different sides of the marketplace. And as soon as you whack one of the moles, like the other two are back and you got to run over there and whack those. And then the first one comes back by the time you do that.
I totally sympathize with that. That is, I haven't described it like that, but that is exactly it. Yeah. Sorry, continue.
Yeah. So, it's hard to pin down one problem when you're running around doing that. But yeah, I mean, I think one of the other things that we've learned the most in building Sherlock over the last year plus is really on the security side. Like we've gone super deep there. We've gotten really into the weeds on it, and that is a hairy problem. And I now understand why some of these guys are sort of like recluses who don't reveal their identities, and they use like three computers, and you send them a PDF, they won't open it, and they'll think you're trying to hack their computer. The security side is scary, and it's messy, and it's not easy, and you're kind of playing defense where there's 1,000 ways the other team can score on you, and you have to protect against all 1,000 at the same time, and that's difficult. I mean, the good news is you can control sort of the attack vectors in a certain way to make sure you win on defense, but you basically have to protect a bunch of different vectors at the same time, and people are potentially always looking to exploit them. So I think the security side of things, it's been eye-opening understanding that space more and understanding how difficult the problem of security is. And I think that's why a lot of traditional audit firms and things like that, they've looked at insurance and they've looked at providing recourse for these hacks or having skin in the game, and they all just sort of walk away from it because they're like, no, we've seen how the sausage gets made. Those sausages are ugly, and we don't want to have any part of making that our business model, which is a huge advantage for Sherlock, because if there is a business here, then most people aren't going after it because it just seems too hairy to begin with. But yeah, I mean, I think three-sided marketplace, security side being, this black box beast that you always have to try to tame. Those are some of the difficulties of spinning up something like Sherlock. And of course, you have to, as you know, build the protocol at the same time and make sure you're doing your own security and all of these things that come with putting a DeFi protocol on chain. So I think the biggest challenge really just comes down to execution and executing well across a bunch of different vectors at the same time.
Okay, cool. Yeah, and then another question I wanted to ask you guys is, or ask you, Jack. I think that you guys do have a token, right? And I'm curious, because I think that this is something we maybe haven't really talked about today, but I think that from my understanding, you guys are sort of have a greater emphasis on eventually decentralizing your business and having Sherlock resemble a smart contract protocol to a greater degree than maybe some of your more centralized competitors. So first of all, would you agree with that statement? And then if so, what are your plans for getting there and decentralizing progressively the protocol?
That is a whole topic in and of itself. And yes, we do have a token. It hasn't launched yet. No one has been like unlocked on it, so it doesn't trade, but we will have a token. It will be trading. And yes, we do plan on sort of decentralizing the protocol over time. Exactly what that looks like, I think, is still up in the air. We're taking steps to progressive decentralization. Actually, one of the really cool parts about Sherlock that we get excited about is our claims process. It's kind of like a boring thing to talk about in insurance, and especially if you're outside of insurance, but our entire claims process is fully on chain, fully trustless. No one can mess with it. The Sherlock core team, we can't even pause it. We can't stop it. We think certain parts of our protocol and certain parts of DeFi need to work like that, where it takes advantage of one of the coolest things of blockchains, which is you can get stuff done, you can make things happen without a centralized entity having their hands in it. And so there are certain pieces of protocols and pieces of DeFi that should work like that. And our claims process works like that. No one can mess with it. There's not even governance really, because it's just this thing on chain, and it happens without anybody kind of pushing it along. So that part's really cool. We like that a lot. Other parts of Sherlock, the trustless, permissionless, automated on-chain stuff doesn't work as well. Like choosing which security experts are knowledgeable and which ones aren't. Really difficult problem to figure out on chain. So you need humans in some sense to kind of be helping that along and saying, okay, they have this pedigree or they've accomplished these things in code arena or whatever it is. And then, kind of like adding them on chain, adding them to the multi-sig, whatever it is that they're taking a part of. And some of those things, they're going to take longer to decentralize. I don't know if we really like the approach that protocols like the Graph have taken, where it's been a very slow, progressive decentralization. They've moved to the Graph Council, which is sort of representatives of different stakeholders in the graph and not the stakeholders themselves. I think, we've seen a lot of voter apathy and other issues where you have this one token, one vote on everything that's going on in the protocol. I don't think that's a part of DeFi or a part of crypto that's going to stick around. I think people are going to understand, like, okay, delegated governance, having representation is great, but I don't want to vote on everything, and I'm not qualified to vote on everything. Like, I want to elect somebody that I think is more knowledgeable and then delegate all my voting power to them. I think that is going to be a big part of crypto moving forwards, and it's going to change the way a lot of DAOs look. And so for Sherlock, kind of figuring that out over time, moving in that direction, decentralizing in terms of having some councils, some multi-sigs that are maybe elected by token holders that can control things before we go into what's classically known as full DAO mode, where, like Compound, everybody votes on everything effectively. I don't know if that's the most efficient way to serve customers and have a great product.
I agree. And I think that that's something that people have talked about in DeFi for a while now. And, there's a reason why governments have like representative democracies, right? Not everything is done via referendum. Yeah. So I think that makes sense. And actually, sort of one of the last things I wanted to ask about is, so you guys have these insurance funds, right? That are sitting there to insure protocols. Do you also use those funds in yield strategies? Like, do you generate yield with those funds? And if you do, it seems a little weird, because if you're using DeFi protocols to generate the yield, it's like you're taking smart contract risk with the funds that are like meant to ensure other protocol smart contract risk. It just strikes me as kind of interesting. I'm curious if you want to say anything about that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I mean, there are some aspects of smart contract security that are kind of walking contradictions in that way. Like the fact that we have a protocol that's on chain, that's a contradiction in itself, because we're trying to help other protocols stay secure, but we also are building a protocol on chain. So I think, there are surface level contradictions like that in this space, which is interesting. And we can talk about, why we decided to build a protocol on chain, and a lot of things that we've done to make sure that, our customers can take some smart contract risk and can do some cool things and innovate. But Sherlock itself, we don't use oracles. We have maybe one of the smallest code bases in all of DeFi. And so we don't take a lot of those risks and like pushing the envelope of innovation that a lot of the other protocols in DeFi take, and a lot of the protocols that we cover take. So that's one aspect to it. And then in terms of, your question of, okay, well, if we're taking insurance funds and we're putting them into DeFi, isn't that a contradiction in itself? And the answer is yes. The way to think about it is there aren't a lot of good options there. So you could just have those funds sit in Sherlock and not do anything with them, but that significantly increases the price of coverage for protocols, because stakers now require a much higher level of premiums to give them a yield that's attractive. So if you just leave the funds in there, the cost of insurance goes way up. And this is a cost that every insurer in the real world knows about this. And that's why, you've heard of Warren Buffett and Geico and like reinvesting the float, that kind of thing. Like, it's a huge part of insurance, is making money on the float and investing those funds in different strategies. So that's one bad situation, is if you just leave the funds in there, the cost of insurance goes way up and is potentially unaffordable for a lot of, protocols. Then you can put the funds into other DeFi protocols. You can say, effectively, like we have, okay, Aave, we think they're pretty safe, and they have a safety module with, 500 million in it. We think they have a good Lindy effect. People seem to trust them. It seems like smart contract security risk is low there. Let's get a reasonable yield from Aave. And of course, that even bit us, because, Aave almost got hacked like 6 months ago. And we had to literally pull our funds out of Aave. Like, we were sitting in a cafe in Portugal, moving a bunch of money because Aave now had this potential of being hacked, and they had to go do an AIP, and we had to wait for it to get done for like a week before we put the funds back in there. So then you always have those kind of risks where you're literally taking smart contract risk at other protocols. And then, of course, you could take the funds and put them into the protocols that you yourself are securing. But then, if one of those protocols suffers an exploit, you suffer twice as much. You have to pay out for that exploit out of the staker funds. And then some of the staker funds are also lost in the exploit itself. So then you end up losing two ways. And so, with a lot of problems in insurance, the answer is really like risk management and diversification. So, we're working to diversify those yield strategies across a bunch of different protocols that we think take different smart contract risks and hopefully aren't correlated. I think we're going to be putting some of those funds into the protocols we ourselves are insuring. So, if we have a risk limit of 1/3 of the pool can only pay out for one hack, then you lose 33% on that hack. I think we might move that risk limit down to 30%, put 5% of the staking pool in some of these protocols that we're insuring. And then the maximum loss goes from 33 to 35%, which isn't a crazy move. And we can start putting capital into protocols that we've actually looked at ourselves and feel good about on the security side. So that is a great point, and that's a difficult problem, and it's something that we're working on. I think diversification is really the answer there, and so we're working on diversifying those funds into a bunch of different places so that if smart contracts do get exploited in one of them, it doesn't cause a super material amount of damage for the staking pool.
Yeah, so just hearing you talk about it sounds kind of like you're kind of like a fund manager, and you're trying to pick protocols where you believe that the cost of insurance is like greater than the actual risk, and you think that your edge is that you have all these security experts and you're really, really smart, and you're a smart guy, so I believe it. But it's kind of interesting. Like, I just never really thought about it that way, and it just struck me.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It's like if we have some competitor out there that's not doing pricing the way we're doing pricing, and they, let's assume there's just some random competitor out there and they decide we're going to price every single protocol at 3%, and we're just going to sell every protocol coverage at 3%. First of all, they're going to have adverse selection problems. They're going to get the riskiest protocols coming in there that they might end up dying. But let's just say they're doing that. Our advantage is we do the deep fundamental work on protocols and say, if we think the price of coverage is less than 3% that we can offer, then we'll take that protocol and we'll win that business. And then we'll kind of build this portfolio of protocols that we think, maybe they're willing to pay us 3%, but we think the risk is 1%. Or I guess we have to compete with that other guy. So maybe we get paid 2.5% and we think the risk is 1%. That's exactly, it's very much like a hedge fund, I guess, in that way, where we're trying to take bets that we think have asymmetric risk rewards and take on protocols where we think the likelihood and cost of an attack is lower than the premiums over time.
Okay, yeah, and just as I'm thinking about it too, I feel like hacks are obviously very widely reported because they're eye-catching headlines and all this stuff. But at the same time, like how many actual exploits of like I would call like high quality DeFi protocols have there really been? Like I think it's something you hear a lot about, but I'll bet if you looked at the numbers and like for like protocols that have like have a good security process, like how many have actually been hacked? It's interesting, maybe more than I think, but it's something. It's yeah, because it's all just like perception, right? Coming from a guy who doesn't price the risk himself.
No, I think that's actually a really good point, and sort of a reason that a lot of people have stayed away from this space. Maybe audit firms have stayed away from this space, is because there's almost like an emotional estimation that you make where you're just like, oh my god, any protocol could get hacked at any time. Like, this is something I do not want to be a part of. This is not a business I want to be in. But then if you look at, okay, how many of these protocols on the rect leaderboard or whatever are protocols that have had great audits, have done things that a normal good security process would entail. There's not that many where you're like, dang, I can't believe that protocol did all the right things and still didn't end up avoiding a hack. Like, there are some examples, and like maybe Compound, I guess, is a good example that happened about 6 months ago. But even then, you sort of have the compound brand and you think of it as being very safe. And then you have the actual process that they were doing when that hack occurred, which was putting unaudited code onto mainnet that the community had sort of written and audited in quotes. If you're looking at that from a fundamental perspective, you're like, well, of course, that's an extremely risky thing to do. So I do agree, like looking at it emotionally, you're like, oh my God, I'm going to just white knuckle this entire thing and be scared of hacks on all these different protocols all the time. But looking at, sort of the limited amount of history that we have, you do see that a lot of these bigger protocols, they're not getting wrecked in a big way. And, bug bounties are a big part of that. There's been a few really big hacks that could have occurred where instead someone took a bug bounty. So I think that's a big piece of the future. Sherlock is super bullish on bug bounties, and we sponsor bug bounties for every protocol we take on. I mean, I think there's like an emotional way to look at it, and that can kind of scare you away from a business like smart contract insurance. And then there's a fundamental way of looking at it, and you can understand a lot of what goes on more easily through that lens, I think.
Okay, so I think we're probably about to wrap this up, and maybe just as a last question, could you tell us a little bit about what's coming next for Sherlock, or what do you see down the road?
Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting initiatives that we have coming down the road. I guess in terms of the more block and tackle ones, diversifying the yield strategies, getting the higher USDC APY up and running for Sherlock now that we're out of the guarded launch. That's the biggest initiative, and kind of getting the staking pool to a point where it's sustainably creating USDC yield. So yeah, I think that's a big one in terms of finding protocols, like Notional, where there's a great USDC yield that we could take advantage of with our yield strategies and help the APY from that perspective, and then bring on more protocols, help the APY from the premiums perspective. But I guess in terms of possibly more exciting things, I do think we're going to be launching actually, you guys kind of helped us even figure out this product or think of this product. You guys actually came up with this product, but we're gonna see if the market likes it. Basically, just doing the bug bounty coverage, and there's a lot of protocols out there like MakerDAO where we can't really offer them a meaningful amount of coverage that they'd be interested in because they've got 10 billion plus TVL, and we can only offer something in the tens of millions in terms of insurance coverage. So not super helpful for them, but they've got the biggest bug bounty out there in the space, which is $10 million. We can insure that bug bounty for them, so they don't have to pay out $10 million twice in the same month and wreck their treasury or whatever it is. They can just know, okay, we're going to pay Sherlock this amount every single month, and it's a very predictable way to manage your bug bounty program. So big thanks to you, Teddy, for coming up with that in a big way. We haven't done too much in terms of talked to a few other market participants, and they seem pretty interested, but we'll see how the broader market thinks about something like that. But yeah, that's sort of just scaling up the V2. It's finally launched. We're finally in a place where we're happy with the smart contracts and the product. And so we just need to scale it and get that core USDC APY up and get more protocols involved.
Yeah, and happy to contribute.
If you're looking for a job, like we're happy.
Yeah.
You seem to have a knack for insurance products.
Yeah. Cool, man. Well, thanks a lot for coming on, Jack. It's great to talk to you, and best of luck for the future of Sherlock.
Yeah, thanks, man. I appreciate it, Teddy. And we've been watching what Notional is doing pretty closely, and super excited for you, and awesome to see the success you guys have had recently. And it's also really cool. I go on there to check like what forward yields are. I'm like, oh wow, if you want to lock something in at 1 year, people are expecting the APY, the market APY, to be way higher. So yeah, really cool product you guys have built, and yeah, man, can continue doing what you're doing, and good luck with it as well.
Okay, thanks a lot, man.
All right, thanks, Teddy. See ya.
Bye-bye.